The St. Paul Suite was composed in 1912 by Gustav Holst while he was the director of music at St. Paul's Girls' School. The piece followed a strong career as a musician, but up to that point, Holst's music was considered uninspiring and he began to develop a talent for writing music for smaller ensembles like string orchestras and chamber groups. He only obtained the position as a musical director in 1905 after several years of unemployment and remained there for the rest of his life. The St. Paul Suite, written near the beginning of his time at the school, became one of his most popular works, second only to The Planets, which was written around the same time. The early 20th century in Great Britain was a time of great technological progress and political changes that influenced different aspects of Holst's work. Though he never recorded the St. Paul Suite, he became one of the first composers to create an audio recording of his work only a decade after composing the St. Paul Suite. The events that most heavily influenced Holst's decision to write the St. Paul Suite may have been related to the suffragette movement. Women all over the country were demanding their right to vote through protests and often riots that destroyed property. As Holst was a professor at a school for girls, he was certainly exposed to the questions and opinions of his students. One of these students, Jane Joseph, took very well to music and collaborated with Holst on many of his works. She assisted him as translator and arranger and helped him organize music festivals and even tutored his daughter. She later became a photographer and wrote literature on careers for women before she died in 1929. Though her life was short, Holst considered her to be something of a genius, and one of her contemporaries stated, "England won't be the same without Jane. I can't imagine music without her." Joseph started at the St. Paul Girls' School in 1909 and played the string bass in the orchestra directed by Holst. She would have been one of the members of the orchestra for which Holst composed the St. Paul Suite and may have performed it at its premiere in 1913. It is possible that Jane Joseph's talent and political views as Holst's student may have inspired him to write the St. Paul Suite as a tribute to the girls he taught and the suffragettes that slowly gained suffrage over the next decade. The first movement of the suite is a lively jig with two themes and alternates between 6/8 and 9/8 time. As the movement is a dance, the two themes are repeated frequently and make the piece very easy to follow and sing along with while providing enough variation that an attentive listener does not become bored. At the opening, the orchestra is in unison except for the resting basses, which produces a very large and unified sound. As the movement progresses, the voices begin to split into chordal harmonies with one or two voices carrying the melody, while the other three play rhythmic chords in the background. The second melody begins at measure 60 and keeps the pattern of one voice playing the theme while the other voices support with chords. The melody also changes key. Interestingly, the first phrase of the melody is largely built on the tones of the dominant chord, in A7, with some passing tones. In the second phrase, the stressed and longer notes are on the tones from the predominant chord. During both of these phrases, the background voices alternate between the predominant and dominant chords. In measure 78, the entire orchestra begins to play chords on beats 1 and 4 of each measure. Though the voices are very mobile, there are only two chords being played. The first and third measures of the excerpt are revoicings of the root position dominant chord, while the second and fourth measures start on a second inversion minor predominant chord that changes to root position on beat 4. These four measures function as a short transition to a rendition of the melody previously introduced in a higher octave. Measure 96 marks a dramatic change in the motion and feel of the jig. Instead of the lively and mobile melodies that have predominated the piece until this point, the melody consists of dotted half and dotted quarter notes that continue through measure 113. This more fluid section is a strong contrast to everything preceding and following. This is the only lyrical section of the movement. The tonality of this section also changes. The D and G sharps in these measures indicate a shift to E major, but the section is harmonically interesting because nearly the entire section revolves around the 2 chord, F minor, with brief 4-measure excursions into the 6 chord, or C sharp minor. After the short E major section, the piece begins a long development that eventually leads back to the second melody when we arrive at measure 192. During this development, the piece modulates and introduces more rhythms and variations while maintaining the prevalence of the two initial melodies. The first major development begins in measure 124, and though the rest of the orchestra repeats the 2-bar motif through the next 8 measures with no change in pitch, the first violins climb a B-flat Mixolydian scale that leads directly into a tutti repeat of the first melody in the original key. At measure 152, the piece briefly has a simple meter feel created by the duplet. This short section acts like an appetizer for the polyrhythm that starts at measure 170. This polyrhythmic section has all the lower voices playing the melody in F sharp major, but instead of the 6/8 compound meter from the rest of the piece, the melody has been recomposed to fit the simple 2/4 time. While the lower voices play the recomposed melody, the violins play a descending 3-note motif in 6/8 time. Though the motif is descending, the first note of every other repetition ascends the F sharp major scale until it resolves into F major and returns to the second melody at measure 184. The recomposed melody combined with the ascending motion in the violins create a great deal of tension for the listener and makes the return of compound meter and the familiar melody feel like a return home. Though the energy level remains constant, the discord and chaos of the polyrhythm resolve nicely into the order and uniformity of measure 188. Measure 192 is the last repeat of the second melody, but instead of D major, this last melody is in F major and is something of a last hurrah for the orchestra. The orchestra returns to the pattern of the melody in the higher voices, with lower voices playing alternating dominant and predominant chords. The last rendition of the second theme begins a shift in the articulation used. Though the melody has divided the notes into slurred couples through the piece until this point, measure 204 begins to articulate each note individually with bow direction changes and becomes even more separated as the entire orchestra shifts to playing block chords at 208. Again, these chords alternate between the predominant and dominant of the key, with measure 214 through 217 re-articulating the predominant chord. Measure 208 also marks the beginning of the accelerando, which will continue until measure 218, where the entire orchestra will rest for 2 full measures. The chord just before the rest is a predominant, which leaves a feeling of expectation that is heightened by the 4 beats of silence. The orchestra then re-enters with a C in several octaves, and then ends with a root position dominant chord, C major, which is a satisfying resolution, but also leaves the audience prepared for the second movement of the suite.